Picture this. What if the most remote continent on Earth isn't remote by accident? What if treaties don't just protect, they conceal? What if ancient maps knew more than modern science can explain? And what if a military operation launched in secrecy ended even more quietly? Antarctica. 7.5 million square miles of ice. The coldest, driest, windiest place on the planet. A frozen desert where temperatures plunge to minus 130 degrees Fahrenheit, where the sun vanishes for months at a time, and where human survival depends entirely on preparation, technology, and international cooperation. But here's what makes Antarctica different from anywhere else on Earth. It's the only continent without a native population. The only landmass governed not by nations, but by a treaty. The only place where military activity is officially forbidden, where territorial claims are frozen in place, and where access, even today, remains tightly controlled. And yet, beneath the ice, beneath the isolation, beneath the carefully worded agreements, there are questions. Questions that don't fit neatly into the official narrative. Questions that span centuries. Questions that, when placed side by side, begin to form a pattern. Welcome to Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. Today we're exploring three mysteries that converge on the same frozen continent. Three stories that, on the surface, seem unrelated, but together, they suggest something far stranger than coincidence. If you enjoy deep investigations into the unexplained, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to set the atmosphere, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Now, let's begin. December 1st, 1959. 12 nations gather in Washington, D.C. The Cold War is at its peak. The space race has begun. Nuclear tensions are escalating. The world is divided. Capitalism versus communism, East versus West. Suspicion and secrecy at every turn. And yet, on this one issue, these 12 nations agree. Antarctica will be neutral. Peaceful. Off-limits to military activity. The Antarctic Treaty was signed with remarkable speed and unusual unanimity. It declared that the continent would be used exclusively for scientific research. No weapons testing, no military bases, no territorial expansion. Any nation could conduct research, but no nation could claim sovereignty. On the surface, this makes sense. Antarctica is harsh, inhospitable, and, at the time, seemingly useless for strategic purposes. Why fight over a frozen wasteland? But here's where the official narrative begins to feel incomplete. The treaty wasn't just about peace, it was about control. Specifically, about controlling access. Article 7 of the treaty allows for inspections. Any signatory nation can inspect another nation's Antarctic stations to ensure compliance. Sounds reasonable. Transparency. Accountability. Except, inspections are rarely conducted, and when they are, they're announced well in advance. Stations are prepared, documentation is ready, there are no surprise visits, no unannounced investigations. So the treaty ensures access, but only on agreed terms. It guarantees transparency, but only within carefully defined limits. And then there's Article 4. This is the clause that freezes all territorial claims. Nations like the United Kingdom, Norway, France, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina had already claimed sections of Antarctica before the treaty was signed. Article 4 doesn't invalidate those claims, but it doesn't recognize them either. It simply puts them on hold indefinitely, which raises a question. Why would nations agree to freeze their claims rather than settle them? What if the goal wasn't to resolve disputes, but to prevent anyone from looking too closely? Consider the timing. The treaty was signed in 1959, just 12 years after one of the largest military operations in Antarctic history, an operation that, despite its scale, remains strangely obscure. An operation led by Admiral Byrd, a man who would later make statements about Antarctica that still fuel speculation today. We'll return to that operation, but first let's look at what else the treaty might be protecting. Because here's the thing about international agreements. They don't just restrict action. They shape narrative. They decide what's acceptable to discuss, what's reasonable to question, and what's too far outside the boundaries of respectable inquiry. The Antarctic Treaty presents itself as a triumph of diplomacy, nations setting aside rivalry for the sake of science and peace. And maybe that's exactly what it is. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part is how little curiosity there is about what's actually down there. For decades, Antarctica has been described as a frozen desert, lifeless, barren, a scientific laboratory for climate research and geology, but otherwise empty. Except it's not empty. Underneath the ice, 2 miles thick in some places, there are mountain ranges, lakes, valleys, entire ecosystems preserved in subglacial darkness. In 2013, scientists discovered Lake Vostok, a freshwater lake the size of Lake Ontario, sealed beneath more than 2 miles of ice for an estimated 15 million years. When researchers finally drilled into it, they found microbial life. Life that had been isolated from the surface world longer than modern humans have existed. If life can exist there, what else might exist beneath the ice? And here's where the treaty becomes even more interesting. Article 5 bans nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste in Antarctica. Again, this seems reasonable: environmental protection, preventing contamination. But it also means that certain kinds of deep exploration, the kind that might require significant energy or excavation, are heavily restricted. You can't blast through 2 miles of ice without international approval, oversight, and justification. So the treaty protects the environment, but it also ensures that whatever lies beneath the ice stays beneath the ice. What happened next raised even more questions. In the decades following the treaty, research stations were established across the continent. The United States operates McMurdo Station, the largest base in Antarctica. Russia maintains Vostok Station, one of the most remote. Other nations, China, Japan, India, Germany, Italy, have their own outposts. But here's what's unusual. These stations are isolated from one another. There's cooperation, yes, data sharing, joint research projects. But the stations themselves are separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles of ice. Communication is limited. Travel between them is difficult and rare. It's as if the continent has been divided, not by borders, but by distance. And then there's the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, operated by the United States. It sits directly on the geographic South Pole, a location chosen not for scientific convenience, but for symbolic significance. Why place a permanent station at the most isolated point on the continent? The official answer: to study the ice core, the atmosphere, and cosmic radiation in one of the most pristine environments on Earth. But that's not the only answer. Because the South Pole isn't just the bottom of the world, it's the convergence point, the place where all lines of longitude meet, the place where, theoretically, if something were hidden beneath the ice, it would be hardest to reach. To this day, no clear explanation exists for why the Antarctic Treaty has remained virtually unchanged since 1959. It's been updated, yes. New protocols added. Environmental protections strengthened. But the core agreement, the restrictions on access, the frozen territorial claims, the control over what can and cannot be explored, remains intact. And no one seems to question why. Perhaps it's because the treaty works. Perhaps it's because Antarctica truly is just a frozen wasteland, best left to scientists and researchers. Or perhaps it's because the treaty was never about protecting the ice. Perhaps it was about protecting what lies beneath it. (1513). The Ottoman Empire is at its height. Constantinople has fallen. The Mediterranean is a battleground of empires. And in the midst of this, an admiral named Piri Reis, a cartographer, navigator, and scholar, creates a map. Not just any map. A map of the world, or rather a fragment of one. Only about a third of the original survives today, preserved in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. But what remains is extraordinary. The Piri Reis Map shows the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and South America. In 1513, South America had only recently been discovered by European explorers. Columbus had made his first voyage just 21 years earlier. The coastline was still being charted, still being understood. And yet the Piri Reis Map depicts the eastern coast of South America with startling accuracy. The shape, the rivers, the geographical features, details that wouldn't be fully confirmed until centuries later. Impressive, certainly, but not impossible. Piri Reis himself explained that he compiled his map from older sources, charts used by Columbus, Portuguese maps, and even ancient texts. He was working from existing knowledge, piecing together fragments of earlier cartography. But here's where the map becomes strange. At the bottom of the Piri Reis Map, extending southward from the tip of South America, is a coastline that appears to match the northern edge of Antarctica. Specifically, it resembles the coast of Queen Maud Land, a section of Antarctica that wouldn't be officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after the map was drawn. Now, on the surface, there are explanations. Perhaps Piri Reis was drawing South America and simply extended the landmass southward based on speculation. Perhaps the coastline is merely a distortion, a cartographic error that coincidentally resembles Antarctica. Perhaps. But here's what complicates that explanation. The coastline on the Piri Reis Map doesn't just vaguely resemble Antarctica. It includes geographical details, bays, inlets, variations in the coast, that align with the actual subglacial coastline of Queen Maud Land. Not the ice-covered surface we see today, but the rock beneath the ice. And that raises an uncomfortable question. How could a map from 1513 show details of a coastline that has been buried under ice for thousands of years? The official discovery of Antarctica is credited to expeditions in the early 1800s. Russian explorers Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev are often cited as the first to sight the continent in 1820. British and American expeditions followed. But if the Piri Reis Map truly depicts Antarctica, then someone knew about it long before the 19th century. The story takes an unexpected turn here, because Piri Reis wasn't the only cartographer to create such a map. In 1531, a French mathematician and cartographer named Oronteus Phineus produced a world map that included an entire continent at the South Pole. He called it Terra Australis. The continent on the Phineus map is roughly circular, centered on the South Pole, with mountain ranges, rivers, and coastal features clearly marked. And here's the strangest part. The shape and size of the continent on the Phineus map closely match the actual shape and size of Antarctica. Not the Antarctica we see today, covered in ice, but the landmass beneath the ice, the actual bedrock topography, which wasn't mapped until the mid-20th century using seismic surveys and ice-penetrating radar. How could Phineus, working in 1531, create a map that aligns with data gathered 400 years later? He couldn't, unless he was copying from older sources. Both Piri Reis and Phineus claimed they were compiling their maps from ancient charts. Piri Reis specifically mentioned sources that predated the Library of Alexandria. Phineus referenced older maps from scholars whose names have been lost to time. What if they were telling the truth? What if, somewhere in the distant past, someone mapped Antarctica when it wasn't covered in ice? Geologists estimate that Antarctica has been glaciated, frozen under ice, for approximately 34 million years. The ice sheets as they exist today have been in place for at least 15 million years, possibly longer, which means that for any map to depict Antarctica's ice-free coastline, it would have to be based on knowledge from an era long before recorded history, an era before the rise of Egypt, before Mesopotamia, before any civilization we recognize. And yet, the maps exist. Modern researchers have attempted to explain the anomalies. Some suggest that Piri Reis and Phineus were simply extrapolating, guessing at the existence of a southern continent based on the theory of a balanced Earth, where land masses in the north would be mirrored by land masses in the south. It's a reasonable explanation. The ancient Greeks believed in Terra Australis long before it was discovered. The idea of a southern continent was philosophically appealing, But philosophy doesn't explain the details. Philosophy doesn't explain the bays, the inlets, the mountain ranges. Philosophy doesn't explain how a map from 1513 aligns with seismic data from 1949. In the 1960s, Professor Charles Hapgood, a historian and researcher, examined the Piri Reis Map alongside other ancient charts. He concluded that the maps could not have been created without access to knowledge that predated known history. Hapgood proposed a controversial theory that an advanced civilization, now lost, had mapped the Earth thousands of years ago, that these maps had been copied and recopied through the centuries, fragments preserved in the libraries of Byzantium, Alexandria, and beyond. Mainstream historians rejected the theory. There's no archaeological evidence for such a civilization. No ruins, no artifacts, no trace of a global seafaring culture capable of such cartographic precision. And yet, the maps remain. In 1996, geologists used ice-penetrating radar to map the subglacial topography of Antarctica in unprecedented detail. When they compared their findings to the Piri Reis and Phineas maps, the similarities were undeniable, not perfect, but close. Closer than coincidence should allow. To this day, no clear explanation exists. Either Piri Reis and Phineas were working from ancient sources that documented Antarctica before it was covered in ice, or they were extraordinarily, impossibly lucky. And if they were working from ancient sources, then who created those sources? And why has every trace of that knowledge, except for these fragments, vanished? August 26, 1946. World War II has ended. The Axis powers have fallen. The world is beginning to rebuild. And the United States Navy launches the largest Antarctic expedition in history. It was called Operation Highjump. The official objective: to establish a research base, test military equipment in extreme cold, and train personnel for polar operations. A reasonable goal. The Cold War was beginning. The Arctic and Antarctic were becoming strategically important. The Navy wanted to ensure it could operate in frozen environments. But here's what makes Operation Highjump unusual: the scale. The mission involved 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, a submarine, 2 seaplane tenders, and multiple icebreakers. It deployed over 4,700 personnel, sailors, scientists, engineers, and support staff. It carried 6 helicopters and 6 flying boats. For a training mission, for a research expedition, that's more personnel and equipment than most wartime operations. The mission was led by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a decorated explorer who had already made multiple expeditions to Antarctica. Byrd was experienced, respected, a national hero, and yet Operation Highjump was unlike anything he had led before. The mission was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It lasted 6 weeks. Officially, the early termination was due to weather conditions and equipment failures. Antarctica's winter was approaching, ice was thickening. Further operations would be too dangerous. But that wasn't the strangest part. What happened during those 6 weeks remains unclear. The Navy released some reports, aerial surveys were conducted, photographs were taken, scientific data was collected. Byrd himself gave interviews after returning, describing the mission as a success. But certain details were redacted, certain reports were classified, and certain statements made by Byrd didn't align with the official narrative. In 1947, shortly after returning from Operation Highjump, Byrd gave an interview to a Chilean journalist. In that interview, he made a statement that has been quoted, misquoted, and debated ever since. He reportedly said that the United States needed to prepare for the possibility of an invasion by aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Not enemy nations, not conventional threats, aircraft, flying from pole to pole. The quote has been disputed. Some claim it was mistranslated, others suggest it was taken out of context. The original source is difficult to verify. But even if the quote is partially accurate, it raises a question. What did Byrd see in Antarctica that made him think about aerial threats? And then there's Byrd's personal diary, or rather, what some claim is Byrd's diary. In the 1970s, a document began circulating, allegedly excerpts from Byrd's private journal detailing events from Operation Highjump that were never officially reported. The diary describes Byrd flying over the South Pole and encountering something unexpected. According to the text, his aircraft was intercepted by disc-shaped craft, objects that moved with impossible speed and maneuverability. The diary claims that Byrd was taken to an underground facility where he met with beings who warned him about humanity's use of nuclear weapons. The diary is almost certainly a fabrication. No original manuscript has been authenticated. The language doesn't match Byrd's writing style. Historians and researchers have dismissed it as a hoax, and yet the diary persists. It's cited in documentaries, referenced in books, shared across forums and websites. Why? Because it offers an explanation. An answer to the questions that the official reports don't address. Why was the mission cut short? Why were certain reports classified? Why did Byrd make cryptic statements about aerial threats? The fabricated diary provides a narrative, a story that fills the gaps. But fabricated or not, it points to something real, the need to explain why Operation Highjump ended so abruptly. And then there are the UFO sightings. During the 6 weeks of Operation Highjump, multiple personnel reported seeing unidentified aerial phenomena. Objects moving at high speed, lights over the ice, craft that didn't match any known aircraft. These reports were never officially confirmed. They exist as anecdotes, second-hand accounts, stories passed down through naval personnel and their families, but they exist. In 1947, the same year Byrd gave his interview about pole-to-pole aircraft, the modern UFO phenomenon began. Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier, the Roswell incident, a sudden global surge in reports of unidentified flying objects. And Antarctica once again became a subject of speculation. What if the objects seen during Operation Highjump weren't anomalies? What if they were part of a pattern? What if Antarctica, isolated, restricted, protected by international treaty, was more than just ice? The official record of Operation Highjump is incomplete. Photographs were taken, but many remain classified. Reports were filed, but key sections are redacted. Byrd himself spoke publicly about the mission, but his statements were often vague, carefully worded, restrained. In the years following Operation Highjump, Byrd returned to Antarctica. In 1955, he led Operation Deep Freeze, another large-scale expedition. This time, the mission lasted longer. Bases were established, research was conducted, and this time there were no cryptic statements, no mentions of aerial threats, no early terminations. It was as if the strangeness of Highjump had been contained. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part is what happened next. Just 4 years after Operation Highjump in 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. A treaty that froze territorial claims, that restricted military activity, that ensured no nation could unilaterally explore, excavate or control the continent. A treaty that some have suggested was less about peace and more about making sure that whatever happened during Operation Highjump would never happen again. To this day, no clear explanation exists for why the mission ended early. No declassified documents have provided definitive answers. No official statements have addressed the rumors, the sightings or Byrd's cryptic warnings, and the diary, fabricated though it may be, continues to circulate, because in the absence of truth, fiction fills the void. So here we are, 3 mysteries, 3 questions, 3 threads that, when woven together, form a pattern. The Antarctic Treaty, an agreement that protects the ice but perhaps also protects what lies beneath it. A treaty that restricts access, freezes claims, and ensures that no nation can act unilaterally. The Piri Reis Map, a fragment of knowledge that shouldn't exist. A coastline drawn centuries before discovery. Details that align with data gathered only in the modern era. A map that suggests someone, at some point, knew Antarctica before the ice. And Operation Highjump, a mission that promised months of research but ended in weeks. A mission led by a decorated explorer who returned with warnings about aerial threats. A mission surrounded by rumors, redacted reports, and a fabricated diary that refuses to fade. 3 mysteries, 1 continent. What if they're connected? What if the treaty wasn't signed to promote peace, but to prevent discovery? What if the maps weren't lucky guesses, but fragments of lost knowledge? What if Operation Highjump found something, and the world decided it was safer to leave it buried? We don't have answers. And perhaps that's the point. Because the truth about Antarctica may not be something we're ready to know. It may be something we've chosen, collectively, to ignore, to freeze in place, to protect behind treaties, restrictions, and carefully worded agreements. Or perhaps there's nothing there at all. Perhaps the treaty is simply diplomacy. Perhaps the maps are coincidence. Perhaps Highjump ended early for exactly the reasons stated: weather, logistics, and the approach of winter. Perhaps. But the questions remain, and they remain because Antarctica itself remains unreachable, untouchable, a continent that exists on every map, and yet feels impossibly distant. A place where the ice doesn't just cover the land, it covers the truth. So we're left with this. A frozen continent, a treaty that never expires, maps that shouldn't exist, and a military operation that ended in silence. And beneath it all, the ice, 2 miles thick, 15 million years old, protecting something, or hiding it, we may never know which. But the questions, like the ice itself, remain. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and drop a comment below. What do you think is really going on in Antarctica? Are these mysteries connected or simply coincidence? And what subject would you like Weird World Files to investigate next? Until then, keep wondering, keep questioning, and remember, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be felt.